And we can get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on and attending this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat and we will address them at the end. This program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. I'd like to now introduce Benjamin Lorr. He is the author of Hellbent, a critically acclaimed exploration of the Bikram Yoga community that first detailed patterns of abuse and sexual misconduct within that community. And he's also the author of The Secret Life of Groceries, which he will be talking about tonight. Lorr is a graduate of Montgomery County Public Schools and Columbia University, and he lives in New York City. So now please welcome Benjamin.
Yo. How you guys doing? Thanks so much for having me. And I will talk to you a little bit about the grocery world, talk to you a little bit about my approach to writing, and then talk to you a little bit about some of the takeaways that I had from this book. But I guess to start from the way top, I'm somewhat of an immersive journalist. That's not how I would necessarily describe myself, but I try to get really close to people and try to learn as much as I can by telling a story in their voice or getting as close to their voice as possible, and you know, kind of holding a mirror up to that experience and a warts and all depiction. And so for my first book was on the Bikram Yoga world. It involved doing gobs of yoga to try to understand. Bikram Yoga is the hot yoga. It's done at somewhere between 100 and 110 degrees, forbidding humidity, like 40% humidity. It was started by Indian guru Bikram Choudhury. And at one point, it was about 17% of all yoga in the world. And I was just fascinated at this yoga that seemed to contradict many of the ideas that I carried around about what yoga was. And I wanted to separate out where that was just a romantic fixation as me as a white American trying to put my ideas on that, and to what extent that was actually how the Bikram yogis saw themselves, and kind of tease out that scene. And I did that by doing lots and lots of Bikram yoga, somewhere between performance art and kind of going undercover and getting as close to the guru Bikram Choudhury as possible. That let people open up and tell their stories. And, you know, it was 2010, so pre-Me Too, but it was a very Me Too story emerged from this, where that community was really in the thrall of a megalomaniacal guru who was quite abusive sexually. He was abusive in non-sexual ways as well. And it's an odd precursor maybe to the grocery world, but I really wanted to take that same approach to the grocery store, which is very similar in many ways. It's a claustrophobically secretive industry, despite the fact that it's something that I think we're all very familiar with. And, you know, we have this institutional experience with it, going there, you know, two times a week, spending as Americans $700 billion a year. And, you know, it's a fixture that we've come to completely take for granted. The industry itself is a very low margin, like 1.5 to 3% margin industry that defines itself on trade secrets, and because of those low margins. And therefore it keeps things really close to the vest, both because they've been burnt by pretty bad press in the past, and because there are pretty bad things that they don't want revealed. And so I decided that I would try to learn as much as I could about the grocery industry by just following people in that world around. I started from the top with Trader Joe, the gentleman, Joe Kalum, who founded Trader Joe's. He passed away earlier this year, but I got to know him about 5 years ago and just picked his brain on everything that went into founding his chain, how he saw the grocery store He started Trader Joe's, or the precursor to Trader Joe's, back in the 1950s. And so kind of the evolution of the grocery world, both through his eye as an executive and kind of strategic visionary, and also just how things have changed since the 1950s to the present day. And then from there, I started following, from that bird's eye view, followed a lot of different characters who are much closer to the ground, often really hidden voices. So I went cross country with a trucker, delivering her rounds, revealing a system of trucking that really bore no relationship to the trucking industry I had in my mind, which was kind of rooted in the 1970s, Jimmy Hoffa, blue collar, scruffy Teamster, scruffy but lovable kind of outlaw truckers. And really the trucking industry had been transformed into a industry that had been deregulated by Carter and Reagan to extreme place where the trucker was really another disposable part, a kind of a commodity part. And most truckers were trapped in a system of debt peonage that they would call sharecropping on wheels, and which is not an overstated descriptor for the world that they were in. And I can talk about that later. But then I went on and followed an entrepreneur on her journey to get her product to shelf. She's a young entrepreneur who had a combination coleslaw salsa that she felt was the next condiment baby that she wanted to bring to America. And following the hurdles on that side of things, to understand how products get to shelf. I then worked in a Whole Foods for a few months, trying to get the retail experience of somebody who is on the retail floor and looking at what's happened to a lot of minimum wage retail jobs over the last 20 to 30 years. And in particular at a place like Whole Foods, which brands themselves as premium. I, from there, went and looked at the kind of, Whole Foods adjacent ethical audits and food safety audits, which underpin our food labels. So all the information that you get on a food label comes from somewhere. It's guaranteed by someone. It's guaranteed by a system of audits. And so I followed the world of the food auditor around and tried to understand why and how, what guaranteed the claims behind those. And then from there, I talked to a retail architect who designs stores and found myself looking at adjacencies between the organic label as a brand and the organic label as an actual guarantor of health, and this retail architect who is kind of looking at the psychological reasons of why we buy what we buy and what's motivating us. So that, and finally, sorry, I dead end into the very bottom of the commodity chain, which the grocery industry is this fantastically large sector of our economy. We spend the least amount of food of anyone in the world as Americans, about 8% of our budget on food. However, it is still a major source of income, and to supply the volume of food that we need, the grocery store has grown to a place where its supply chains are no longer function in kind of a linear fashion, and they're no longer like corporate flow charts where you can track them back down to source. The volume is so incredible that when you get to the real bottom of most commodity chains, there's a lot of there's brokers who aggregate products, and then buyers who aggregate from those brokers who've aggregated. So aggregators of aggregators of aggregators, which means there's a tremendous lack of visibility to the bottom. And so I did my best to try to go to the bottom of the supply chain. And I used Thailand and the Thai seafood industry as kind of a microcosm for those problems, because it is incredibly decentralized, which and oftentimes is held up as a virtue. It's full of smallholder fishers. family boats or boats that could be termed family, even if they're not run by a family, and looked at the consequences of a supply chain that suffers from that lack of visibility and is directly tied to us as consumers on top, shopping with our price comparisons and our picky ingredients list, and the buyers for the supermarket trying to serve us as consumers, and the exporters and trying to serve them, and the importers trying to serve them, and the manufacturers trying to serve them, and the aggregate, and all the way down this kind of chain to the raw material extractors at the bottom, be they fishers or aquaculture farmers in that industry. And that really formed the that kind of formed the scope of the book. And so it's a really broad look, but it's all told through very individual voices along the chain, whether that's, the eyes of the trucker, the eyes of the entrepreneur, or at the bottom, the eyes of a migrant who's traveling from Myanmar to Thailand looking for a better life, and ends up getting kidnapped and placed on a boat fishing for the protein that is at the bottom of the shrimp aquaculture pyramid. And that kind of dual perspective of trying to map out the big systems and then trying to humanize them with characters with human characters is really where I'm at as a writer, and what I'm trying to do. I can give you a few images to tie into this, because I apologize, I'm doing a lot of talking because that seems the only way to do this in Zoom, but I'm going to try to, I'll walk you through some of the sections that I just mentioned, and then we can kind of get into some details. This is, let's see, Joe Kaloum, founder of Trader Joe's, who, was really an incredible guy in many cases. I went into this book, I'm not a Trader Joe's fan. I'm a Trader Joe's agnostic. One of the things that first got me interested in this book was I was hanging out with all these Bikram yogis for the last book, and they went to a Trader Joe's in the middle of this teacher training, and I just saw the level of excitement that these yogis had for Trader Joe's. I mean, it was like kids going into an amusement park, and I just wanted to understand how a chain could produce that type of glee and cult-like following that really dovetailed the cult, the yoga cult that I was following. So I walked into this book thinking there's got to be something too good to be true about Trader Joe's. The prices are really low. The employees are kind of pathologically happy. I don't know if you've been to a Trader Joe's. They're kind of funky and selected for being offbeat, and piercings and earrings, and they have the Hawaiian shirts. And so I walked in pretty cynical, thinking like, where's the catch here? And there are some catches, and they're definitely the catches that you will find in the grocery industry as a whole, in terms of really being trapped in a race to the bottom where labor suffers. But Trader Joe and Joe Kaloum really saw the grocery industry as a extremely complacent industry that was in need of disruption. So he entered in the mass market 1950s, kind of the height of American homogeny in terms of both our media channels. All of our media was coming from basically the same sources. And the grocery store at that time fetishized continuous goods, commodity goods that kind of just could be pumped out. Bounty paper towels, Coca-Cola, Folgers coffee. These were the staples. And if you were a supermarket buyer, you were really in the business of replenishment. You would just stock your shelves with these goods. And Joe decided to kind of disentangle the notion of commodity and bring that to his customer base by focusing in a hyper way it's something that's now seems totally mundane because we get this all the time, especially with the internet. But by focusing on a target demographic, that he could then start predicting what they would want and what outside of the mainstream would appeal to them. And focusing on discontinuous goods that couldn't be pumped out, and that he could therefore find value at. Because if you're trying to get the lowest price in Coca-Cola in the land, there's only one way to really do that, and that's to get to be the biggest possible chain, so you can negotiate with Coca-Cola in terms of a volume discount. And that's a really unstable business to get to. And you see Amazon and Walmart are essentially in a race to that, and it's a two-person race. But if you're a smaller chain like Joe was you had to figure out an adjacent way to compete. And you know, he did that in many ways. You know, his demographic specificity in terms of really locating who would be a Trader Joe's consumer, and he zoomed in, and he was located in Pasadena, which is a college town, and he zoomed in on this like professor, like overeducated, underpaid, somebody who is just beginning to travel. This was the 1950s. And one of his big revelations was in early 1960s when the 747 came online, and he realized that this was going to democratize travel in a new way. And suddenly all these overeducated, underpaid, professor-like people were going to multiply, because travel was this bona fide form of education, and it was going to be opened up to many, many more people than possible. And they were going to, you know, he would say this in very semi-cynical terms. They're going to travel, and they're going to want to eat the things that they travel to taste. Their tastes are going to be broadened. Similar, you know, right in the mid 1960s, he noticed that the GI Bill was going to hit a wave of veterans coming back from Vietnam. And so that was another form of education that was going to cause people's taste to change. So he zoomed in on this demographic, and then created a store to really serve them. And he did so in ways that were different from the rest of the grocery industry. Most of the grocery industry, like I said, was operating on continuous goods and operating on a volume game. So the first grocery store supermarket to ever open in 1930 was something like 9,000 square feet. By the like mid 60s, they were already up to 20 to 30,000 square feet. And now we have like 100,000 foot superstore, Sam Clubs, right? Things have just grown bigger and bigger and bigger. And he realized pretty quickly that if you grow in size, you can't keep growing in terms of asking your buyers to grow in quality, right? If you're a store that has 100,000 SKUs, so that's stock keeping units, individual items in the store, you can't have a buyer in charge of understanding 100,000 different items. It's just an impossibility. And so Joe really went in the opposite direction and cut down that SKU count hard to you know, from the average in the country at having about 65,000. The average Trader Joe's when he started out had about 1,500. So like radically smaller, and then allowed his buyers to do what they, you know, to actually get into the nuts and bolts of the supply chain and innovate. So if you can't compete with Safeway on peanut butter, because peanut butter is basically commodity good, you can create almond butter and ask your nut manufacturers to start grinding up almonds. So Trader Joe's essentially invents almond butter as a consumer product, whole cloth, because he both slimmed down his SKU count enough that his buyers had the free time to start thinking about these things. And then when they thought about the problem of peanut butter hard enough, they realized there was no way to win on it unless we kind of go sideways. And you can see that in the Trader Joe's of today, in their fixation on things like avocado oil as opposed to canola oil. There's a lot of adjacency still there, although in many ways it's been kind of watered down. And so that's Trader Joe's. This was the trucking industry. This was the cab of the lovely woman that I ran around with. Like I mentioned, trucking has been pretty much deregulated and commodified. Trucking is a totally blue collar job at this, blue collar job, but it requires a lot of training. It's not the type of job that you and I could just step into. It's a job that, first you have to get your commercial truck driving license, and then you have to go to school to actually and train with a trainer. The problem is that the job itself is difficult, it's unpleasant, and you take on a lot of debt to get to get your CDL, your commercial truck driving license, and to get that training. And that debt can then be used as kind of a cudgel to force you to work, even after you've decided that you don't really want to be a trucker anymore. It's a pretty, I'll try to contextualize it with the woman I drove around with was grossing $120,000 a year for the carrier that she was driving for. She was taking home $17,000 a year. The weeks that I was with her, she took home a paycheck of $100 a week, because the debt that she was carrying, there were so many deductions from her paycheck that there was really nothing left for her. And so she was taking cash advances out of future paychecks for the time I was with her, so she could afford to eat on the road. And she's not a lone example. She's not an extreme example. The industry, industry offered numbers. So this is not like the industry critic numbers. The industry offered numbers has industry turnover at somewhere between 95 and 116% over the last decade, which means that every single trucker who entered in the trucking industry quit or was fired or left within that year. And obviously in the years where it's over 100%, that means that cycle repeated additionally. And you can compare and contrast that to other low wage jobs, and it's nothing like that. Starbucks, is a low wage job, and I think turnover there is in the 30% to 40% range. Top law firms deemed it like a crisis in the profession when they were at 20% turnover. So to contextualize, like 116%, it's like this. It's a real example of how much that job is a miserable job, and people don't want to be doing it. But they get lured in with promises of wages, and then and then they get kind of sucker punched by debt and low training rates, and then they get flushed out of the system, and there's new recruits. Again, when the woman I was following and the trucking company that I was following with her was recruiting hundreds of people a week for these jobs, and they tens of thousands of people a year, and it was just this constant turnover. And it's also a massive industry, I should say. Trucking is the number one employer in the majority of states. And pretty much everything that we get in our lives comes to us on a truck in some form. So finding out both the ways that this deregulation benefits us as consumers, and is really a conscious policy choice to bring us low prices, but also is causing immense suffering for the actual workers in the industry, was pretty eye-opening. And let's see, I actually use trucking as a vehicle to kind of sneak into various warehouses and fulfillment centers. This was Julie, the condiment worker that I mentioned before, who was bringing her product to shelf. Following her was another extremely eye-opening. I had no idea what it takes to bring a product to shelf. I can tell you, it is almost every assumption I had is off had to throw that out. Julie bringing salsa, this combination coleslaw salsa, was not competing against other condiments. She wasn't competing against relish. She wasn't competing against ketchup. She's competing against the store itself, which was operating much more like a landlord leasing space and asking for free product or direct cash payments for inches on their shelf. And I'm not talking about end caps or these kind of big displays at the end of the aisle, which I think we intuitively know are basically a form of advertisement, and therefore producers are paying for them. I'm talking about inches on the shelf anywhere. And so it's very costly to get your foot in the door. And if you're a young entrepreneur who's trying to scale up from a farm market to a nationwide rollout, it's often impossible unless you attach yourself to venture funding. And so there's this interesting dynamic that occurs where it changes the food that we get. You have to partner with big capital to get fledgling food out into stores now, which wasn't always the case. There used to be a gradual on-ramp for some of these products. And so that was really interesting to watch. And I mean, I can't do any of these things justice in a talk like this, but because Julie is also like totally hilarious, perplexing, passionate person who really truly loves salsa like her child. And so just being involved with an entrepreneur who can invest a level of meaning into a combination, a kind of mealy orange coleslaw salsa, that's what I'm after as a writer, just trying to understand the people. And there's me at Whole Foods working on the retail floor. I'll go quickly because I've talked a lot. This is breaking into caged egg facilities, swine facilities, following these auditors as they kind of guarantee our food. That's another extremely fascinating area that I really had no idea what was going on prior to this. Auditing, which underpins all food safety, ethical claims, is a for-profit industry that is ripe with conflicts of interest that make absolutely no sense from a getting actual ethical food. It is also debatably effective for food safety, where you're dealing with empirical things like pathogens that you can track and measure. It is an abysmal system. And even I searched far and wide for people who would defend the audit system, looking for people who would talk off record about why this was a good system. And it was very difficult to find. Even people who are making tremendous amounts of money wouldn't defend the system. They would talk about how it was a necessary bridge to something else. But be that as it may, when you're dealing with things that aren't empirical, that don't have like a pathogen or a temperature check next to it, like someone withholding wages 6 months ago in a foreign country, it becomes a system that it just doesn't really work. The auditor is not charged with enforcement, can't bring in legal action if they do uncover, can't talk to workers to actually get their points of view without the supervision of management, which obviously is pretty ineffective if you're somebody who's afraid of losing their job, can't open closed doors, can't look in locked files. It's just a really toothless way of doing this. And yet it is the only thing that's beginning to change in this slightly. So only maybe slightly, but it's 95% of the way that things like rainforest friendly, organic, fair trade, these are guaranteed. And so that was a big takeaway from the book of just how badly reform is needed there. And then finally, like I said, I went to Thailand, tracked basically every aspect of the shrimp supply chain and followed a migrant in his journey to be kind of a raw materials extractor. Those are in this corner. These are little fish that this migrant was getting off of his boat. That they're called trash fish, and they go to be turned into fish meal, which then get turned into shrimp food, which then grow the shrimp that we get in our stores. And like I said, this migrant was captured and enslaved. This was not his boat. I couldn't go on his boat, but I snuck aboard a different boat, and you can see the living conditions. So this picture on the far right is where he was sleeping, and if you see the bottom part of that, these are the crawl quarters that the men were forced to sleep in. That came up to my thigh. To put that in perspective, they were sleeping about 4 hours a night, and they were working 20 hours a day. Many are given drugs to like amphetamines to work. On this boat, he was given granular coffee, instant coffee, and they would just eat it by the spoonful. And then they were sleeping in this, 20 men down below in these quarters that basically went up to my thigh, and fishing for this trash fish that is an aspect of the industry that nobody wants. There's no shrimp manufacturer who's out to try to, there's no shrimp manufacturer who's out to try and have slave labor involved in their shrimp. But the fact is that they just can't see down to that bottom of the supply chain. So anyway, I've now talked a mouthful, and I apologize for it. But if anyone has any questions about anything in particular, about process, about writing, about groceries, I am happy to just riff on it.
Feel free to unmute yourselves as well. I should have said that earlier. You can type in the chat or just unmute yourself.
This is such a fascinating subject, and it's something that we frequent for a couple of hours every week, and yet I know so little about it that I don't even know what questions to ask. It's very interesting to hear about Trader Joe's, and I mean, that reminds me that I heard recently that there was a big kerfuffle about how sustainable their packaging is or something.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much interesting about this whole, so I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about a few things. I mean, one, in many ways, that was the whole reason I wanted to write the book. I mean, in some ways, COVID did a lot of this work for me. I was just obviously writing the book before COVID, finished the book before COVID. But in my mind, the grocery store is this miraculous thing that we frequent. The options that are available to us in a grocery store are mind-blowing. In fact, and a grocery store is an entirely American innovation. It is as American as jazz, the t-shirt, right? And when it started migrating overseas, the first one to open outside of America was in Rome in the 1950s. People lost their minds. Like there are press reports of the opening of this first grocery store in Rome of women running up and down the aisle screaming. And they were shrieking like, "This is heaven. This must be heaven. I must have died and gone to heaven." Because no one had seen this abundance of options, this amount of food before, and the prices are significantly lower because the grocery store is a volume game, and they could radically cut prices from the general store that existed before it. Mm-hmm. So contextualizing that miraculousness that we've totally lost because it's become just a chore in the most banal sense, it was really important to me. And then also seeing the human labor that underpins it. And this is not a God-given miracle. This is a miracle that is human-made, and tracking down the different people who are working on our behalf to give us this bounty, which we until recently had been pretty happy taking for granted. I see a question in the chat. Which country was that last shrimp from? So I was in Thailand, and so all of my research was rooted in Thailand. I think what I do a very good job in the book doing, and which I haven't done a good job, is talking about just how the problems in Thailand are not unique to Thailand. And in fact, one of the most dangerous things that came out of this, and while I was writing, a number of other reporters were also reporting on this. The AP did a massive report and actually won a Pulitzer for this. And The Guardian did a massive report on it and got justifiable accolades. So world attention kind of crashed down on Thailand, and people started avoiding Thai shrimp and buying elsewhere. And every expert that I talked to, whether they were grocery side, on the business side, in the supply chain, or whether they were on the human rights side, or whether they were in the NGO side and the migrant labor side, all said that this displacing consumer purchases from Thailand will just displace the problem. The price of shrimp is unsustainable, and it will just start, if industry starts to grow in India, which is what happened, and the Philippines and Malaysia, and they are offering these prices, even though it's so difficult to get eyes on this bottom of the supply chain, even though we don't have eyes there yet, those labor abuses, especially in India, where we know they have a caste system, there's no chance that these labor abuses aren't going to just displace over there with the low price. So to some extent, and I see these questions about like, what do I do with buying? One of the big takeaway from the book is to challenge this notion that I think has been dominant in food ideology in my life, which is that you can vote with your dollars and that you can buy the right thing if you pay enough attention. And I think that is really seductive. I want to believe that. And I want to believe that if I learn enough that I can act in an ethically pure manner. And it turns out that for the most part, especially if you're, in this like mid-level of expertise that I think is the only reasonable place, like book level expertise of someone who's spent 5 years researching a book, which is where I am, much less a consumer who just reads the product of that research, and you're one step more removed. There's the supply chains are so dense that, and marketers are so adept at kind of converting our good intentions towards virtue into a saleable product that has virtue, that there is really no, a very little effect between our consumer purchases and change on the ground, which is not to say things are hopeless and you can't have change on the ground. It's just that it doesn't come from buying things. It comes from policy level things. It comes from supporting unions. It comes from strengthening workers' rights. It comes from trade treaty negotiations that include enforcement arms and that don't just push enforcement onto retailers. It says nation state police should be the ones who are worrying about people who are kidnapped, not a grocery buyer, which obviously doesn't make any sense if you think about it. But that is the current state. We're expected a grocery buyer should be the one who's reforming the supply chain that involves mafia style criminals. And again, if you look in the book, you can see the depth of these problems. They're not isolated actors. They are very sophisticated criminal networks often. And even more than that, they rely on vast global wealth inequities. So Thailand is a very wealthy regional power in Southeast Asia, and Myanmar is very poor. And there's a gradient of wealth. And the man I followed grew up in a village that didn't have any money. He didn't have jobs. He bundled wood to sell at the capital of his home state for pennies. And the whole community was basically undone by starvation. And so he just dreamed of a better life, and he went to get a better life. And he didn't see himself as a victim, and frankly didn't see himself as a victim even after he was kidnapped and put on a boat and lost his arm to being essentially enslaved. He never saw himself as a victim. This is what I had to do. I feel very lucky I lived through this process. And I think he meant that lucky sincerely, not ironically. So all of which is to say, that type of structural wealth inequity from Myanmar to Thailand is not something that a grocery buyer or a grocery auditor is equipped to deal with. So I see this question on voting with the dollars. And if it's not done en masse, it doesn't affect manufacturing. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with voting for your dollars. I do believe there have been substantial reforms with organic. I think that there's a lot of great stuff has happened because we've shifted. I don't know to what extent those were consumer driven and to what extent those were policy driven. I think there's a lot of disagreement about that. And you can find people who will make very compelling arguments on both sides of that. And similarly, I think if you make a personal connection with a farmer, with a producer, with a fisher, That's very different than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about going into a store and buying a can of tuna that says on the label it's ethical versus the one that isn't ethical. And I'm not even saying don't do that necessarily. I still do that. I'm saying don't expect that to drive change. Whatever you're doing is mostly for your own virtue, and own feeling of virtue. That is not, in my opinion, a way that we will eventually change and reach a sustainable future with sustainable fishing. Buying the right can of tuna. There's so much cloudiness separating that consumer price decision from the facts on the ground. So maybe that answers that question.
There's another question of what do you think of discount grocery stores like I've never heard of Lidl and Aldi I know Aldi that seem to be recent and spreading into the grocery store world.
Totally. I mean, so Aldi is actually the parent company of Trader Joe's at this point. It was not the parent company when Joe was CEO and president. He sold it to them at the end of his tenure, but he sold it to them because actually he found a lot in Aldi that was a kinship to him. Aldi, so like I said, American grocery stores kind of grew. Bigger is better. Biggest is best of all. We're gonna innovate through volume. And we're going to take the price savings and volume, and we're going to use that to increase the size of our offerings bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And Aldi was born at the end of World War II in Germany, very much in the wake of that destruction. It was founded by two brothers who decided, instead of growing bigger and bigger, we are going to ruthlessly compete on price among a very small number of options. So they would go to manufacturers and price a generic like mayonnaise, and then mark it up as little as possible. And I will blank on the exact percents they used, but they would include very little markup on that product, and they would sell it for a very low margin. And they would focus on only an extremely small number of products, and they would kind of play manufacturers off each other to get the lowest price for the small number of products they were offering. And it is a very, very competitive model because the prices themselves are so low that it drives consumer demand, and you can sustain it when you don't have, you're not offering 15 types of mayonnaise, you're only offering one type of mayonnaise. So you can maintain a degree of control there. So, which is to say, like, they're really interesting. I don't know, if you're looking for quality price savings, like they offer it, they do. There are obviously, you're making a trade-off too. You're not getting the best mayonnaise when you're doing that. But they have a different model that is, it's not necessarily that there's like getting worse, like gross product, or like they're cost saving through their supply chain, through their decision not to have the inefficiency of tons of product, and through authentically, like, not like Aldi in particular, not caring at all about advertising. They advertise through their product, and they get off strip locations, and all of that goes into their prices. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer.
There's another question too. What surprised you the most in your research?
I mean, the trucking stuff was very surprising. I think I walked into that thinking it would be a fun chapter to write. Like, oh, I get to ride around with a trucker. I've always secretly thought that would be a fun thing to do. And it was like, no, nothing about this is fun. Like spending 120 hours in a truck in a row, not fun. The like human experience of this trucker was like, she was essentially homeless. She had a storage unit that she was living out of, and her cab. She had lost all her teeth because she didn't have good health insurance. She, as I said, was taking cash advances out of future paychecks to pay for current meals. It was thoroughly depressing, and it was all real, but I think that was pretty shocking. At that point that I went on the trucking expedition, I had already mapped out the book. I had already talked to a lot of NGOs in Thailand. I had already knew that human bondage was alive and well in 2020. Those things weren't surprising, but I was surprising to see how parallel the same economic forces worked in America on people that I passed every day in the gas station, at the truck stop. They were just going to a different side of the rest stop than I was. They were going to the trucking side and I was going to the car side. And I had this mental image of what their life was like, and it really didn't map to reality.
Are there more questions? You can unmute yourself or type in the chat. One I had written down that maybe can function as the last question is, what do you see as the future of grocery stores?
Yeah.
And is it rosy?
Question. Say again?
Is it rosy or is it the dark?
I think there's both. So I think COVID really accelerated the shift to the online world. That was happening prior. That shift is going to do two things. So I've been talking about a lot of like the dark parts of the grocery world with these races to the bottom that are nested throughout the system. And they really, and again, I want to say they start up at the top with the grocery buyer who's just trying to serve this consumer who is ready to price comparison shop and go find the cheaper product. And it's all relative cheaper. It's like, just because you're price comparison shopping doesn't mean that you're suddenly running to Aldi and getting the lowest price, but you're looking for the cheaper organic. You're looking for the cheaper this, you're looking for the cheaper that within your frame of value. So these nested loops at the bottom are going to exist. That they're a consequence of market capitalism to a large place. They actually produce tremendous benefits for consumers, and they're all going to be really accelerated by the shift to the online world, where employees are no longer consumer facing. When I was working in Whole Foods, we were told we got to smile constantly, smile, 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 smile. That's like, we're Smile Town, we're Yes Town. We say yes to everything. We smile at everyone. We were these little agents of bringing joy to consumers, or trying to, and to do that, there was some minimum standards of our own happiness that had to be met. You can't have people, it really wasn't at a Disney Dickensian like this, like it wasn't at a place where we were faking our smiles. We were pretty, there was plenty of complaints about that job, but the smile is a pretty authentic one. From what I understand, working in Amazon warehouses or in other behind the scene places, like that small incentive isn't there. And so I do think that online shift, as things stack up, unless there's some policy level reforms, will result in like a darker world for workers. On the other hand, I think as things scale up, nobody has currently figured out how to sell online in a way that replicates the in-store experience. I haven't seen it done, at least. And so there is still a very much like, you go to a store and you have this associative journey where you're like planning your meal as you're walking through, picking out your cilantro because you suddenly decide you want to make taco meat, and that journey is always gonna be something that consumers want. And I think it's going to actually, it kind of like the yin and yang of like, as the online space grows and many of our products shift to like, we just learn to click and order the same things every time. There's going to be smaller footprint stores that then specialize in kind of the cracks of these giants in creating that associative journey. And so these smaller footprint stores, they can offer much more personalized things. I think are going to be really exciting spaces. And I see, do you foresee organic prices coming down in the future? Yeah,
There was also a connected question too. Someone had asked, because they came in late. Did you say that organic is also not necessarily a reliable label? If you want to tie that into that question together.
No, organic is so of all the labels, organic is actually a USDA program. It is not a for-profit label. So rainforest friendly, the paleo, whatever, gluten-free, all of those labels are guaranteed by the for-profit audit industry, which is a $50 billion a year industry. USDA organic is a government-funded program. So in some ways, organic is more reliable. They're government auditors, or at least they are farmed it out to other places. I think in general, there are, when you start talking about global organics, there is a lot of fraud in there. Nobody really knows how much fraud is in there. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture of organic. There's a lot of critics who will tell you a lot of bad things about it, but I would say it's probably a little better than some of these others, because it is, it doesn't have some of the bad incentives that other auditors do. So essentially, because it's a for-profit audit system, I didn't explain this before, that the manufacturer is paying for the auditor to come and audit them. It's something that as a producer, you have to pay for. And so you can shop for the auditor of your choice in some of these venues. And you can also pay that auditor to give you a special class on how to pass the audit. Or get a practice audit a few weeks before if you pay a certain amount of money, or redo the audit because you just pay it for it again. And all of these reasons, these are all things that don't really have parallels with USDA organic, which is good.
Well, thank you so much, Benjamin. This is absolutely enlightening. If you're interested in purchasing or getting Benjamin's book, it is available at Porter Square Books or on his website, benjaminlorr.net. And you can also get it through the library in our library network.
Yay, libraries.
And this program is recorded and was recorded and will be on our YouTube page, which you can just search Carey Library. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you again, Benjamin, for this fascinating talk.
Hey, thank you, and thanks for putting up with my rambling. It's a really wide-ranging book, and so it's hard to find roads into it. But I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, and you can
I think you were fabulous. I think you were a great speaker.
What is the name of the book again?
Say again?
What is the name of the book? I was a few minutes late getting in.
The Secret Life of Groceries.
Okay, great, thanks.
And I'll
can find it in bookstores everywhere. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Benjamin.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.